Thank you, Professor 傅维。无论创业是否成功，一定要保持对美好生活的追求和一个健康的身体。非常的中肯的建议。Yes, Scott will be speak first. So Scott, you ready? Yeah, please come here. Thank you. Scott Burton.
Thank you. Oh, very exciting. I haven't been in front of a group like this in, I can't even remember. It's been a long time, but it's nice. It's very nice to be able to get into one room and address a group of people. So I was asked to talk about a number of things. I thought the easiest way for me to do this was to talk about my China experience. And I said at the bottom, why do I always keep coming back? It's not so much that I necessarily want to come back all the time. It just seems that I'm always pulled back in. I don't know if you remember the Godfather movie where the Godfather's trying to get out of the business and get into legitimate business. And his line was, just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. And I feel like that's happened to me many times in my career. So should I do it myself? This one? Okay, a lot of information here. I'm not going to go through all of it, but let me just paint the broad picture here. I've been working in China within 4 decades, okay, going back to the early 90s. And it involved 8 different companies, and just by the numbers, 2 of those were joint ventures, 3 of those were actually working for Chinese companies, and the balance, the other 3 were wholly foreign-owned enterprises. So it's all the different kinds of business models that you might think about when you're working in China. So I've seen it all. And starting in the early days, I wasn't living in China. I was just going there and transferring technology into a factory that Seagate already had in Shenzhen, and then later in Wuxi. And then at the end of my time in Seagate, I had the opportunity to run all of Malaysia and China. So I was basically running all of those operations. At the end of that, I got out of China. I went back to the US. But then I started in a new industry, which was semiconductor equipment with advanced energy. That's when I got pulled back into China. So first thing I did was set up a factory in Shenzhen, leveraging my old resources from Seagate and also the relationships that we had, because we had, it's interesting to note, the Seagate operations at the end of the 1990s, the combination of those 2 factories represented the largest exporter in China, significantly larger than anyone else at that time, in the billions of dollars. And these are small numbers today, but in those days, it was really a big deal. And so that fostered really a lot of credibility. And I was able to go in and talk to the governments in Shenzhen and Wuxi and get a lot of benefits and support from them. So that's why I went back in the 2000s to Shenzhen and Wuxi to set up my new companies. I will go through a little bit of detail in photographs on my CNBM experience, just to give you a flavor for what kinds of things happened to me and some of the experiences I had. So in the 2010s, just prior to that is when I got into solar. So I spent 15 years in solar energy. That's how I know Mr. Xionggang, because we've known each other quite a long time as colleagues in the solar industry. But I only just recently, he called me thinking I was still in solar, and I just recently got out of solar, but I'm still kind of a walking encyclopedia of solar information if anybody wants to hear about that. Yeah, so that's kind of the lay of the land. And at the very end of it, I was working in solar up until early this year, only in the US, had nothing to do with China. And then all of a sudden, now I'm working for a Chinese company. So I got pulled back in. That was the 4th time I got pulled back in. So I made a top 10 list of just things that I have experienced or things that have happened to me. The first is, and you hear about these stories sometimes, but I'll give you a little insight. Being detained in China. This really happens. It happened to me. Normally, when I'm leaving China, I'm alone because I'm on a business trip. This particular trip, I was with my wife, my two sons, and our dogs, and pretty much everything we owned, and we were heading back to the US. And it was on that particular attempt of trying to get out of China that I was held back at customs and I wasn't able to leave. And that has to do with one thing you should realize about the legal system is that it can be used to make things very inconvenient for you by other people or other companies without due process. And so that's just something you have to realize. In the end, I got the whole thing resolved, but it took a matter of months to get this whole thing resolved, and it cost me some money to do that. So the second thing that is very common is building big factories that the government will basically pay for, and they'll build them very rapidly, and then basically that allows you to avoid a lot of the costs that you face if you're trying to operate in the US or pretty much anywhere else in the world. It's a big form of subsidy, and that's a very, I was able to capitalize on that. So that's a good experience that I had. I think you can see number 3. So if you're wondering where that happened, it was in Lijiang in Yunnan, So I guess the only thing I'd say about that is I didn't know the dog was dog until after I ate it, and that was everyone's favorite dish. They said, "What is that?" And they said, "It's dog." Okay, I think maybe a lot of you have your Baiju stories, so I won't go into that, but I've gone through that experience. I've been in the JV with the government. I built a lot of factories in China. Two of my projects were squarely affected and very negatively affected by first SARS around the end of 2002, and then, of course, COVID last couple of years. So those had major impacts on projects that I was trying to execute during those times. The Chinese companies that I've worked for, the 3, I was either the only Caucasian employee or one of maybe 2 or 3. And if you have a question about whether I speak Chinese, not very good. Hu hao, yi tian tian, on a good day. Okay. Anyway, go to the last one. 4 times I escaped. 4 times I got pulled back in. I can't seem to get away from China, so I must love it. So things I've learned, the trade tensions, that people, especially it's very clear in things like solar, where there's the silicon, the origin of the silicon. There is the technology transfer related to semiconductor, and all these things are real, and they have real impacts on people's businesses. And they had impacts on businesses that I was working on. So for example, those companies that I listed, like Advanced Energy and Brooks Automation, the products that they were building in China and selling in China, they no longer build those in China, and they no longer sell those in China. So those operations were completely dismantled and taken outside of China, and now they can't even sell those in China. So some sectors have been hit very hard by some of these trade issues. So legal system, I'm not going to go into that because we have a real expert here who will speak later. But I gave you my example of how I was impacted by the legal system. The other thing I noticed time and time again is that the market is generally not available for non-Chinese companies. That has not been true in technologies where there's no other option, so that in China you have to buy from outside companies to get that technology. But as soon as it's a level playing field on technology, you basically are constructively excluded from pretty much any market opportunity. So opportunities that I see for Chinese entrepreneurs, there's a lot of activity in semi-equipment and other high-tech equipment in China, okay, because you can't buy it. So companies are scrambling to figure out how to make advanced power supplies, how to make, etch and CVD tools, other things that go into some of these semiconductor and high-tech applications. So that's a good opportunity. Software, of course, is a great opportunity. EV-related technology, okay, it's an obvious one, but I was really blown away. I made my first trip to China last month since pre-COVID. I was there for 3 weeks, and I could not believe, and all this happened during the COVID period. It's almost completely transitioned over to electric vehicle. It's like every license plate you see is green, at least in the major cities where I was, and I couldn't believe it. And there's so many brands. So I would say China's way ahead, and the trade of not cars per se, but some of the technologies like heads-up displays and software, fuel cells, and all the components that go into EVs. I think that's a big opportunity for trading cross-border. Now, the consumer business, in my view, I'm talking about sort of the heart of the trade engine, which is anything from computers to smartphones to what have you, any kind of gadget you can speak of. I don't think that this was, with the exception of logistics and other things that COVID created, I don't think that right now is impeded by the current trade conditions. I think that's all still wide open, with the exception of maybe access to semiconductors in certain cases. The other thing, knowledge. It used to be that everybody's coming to the US and other places for education. And I think that in China, they should consider stepping up the game on higher education. And I think that current will reverse, and someday people will be going to China for education. And then infrastructure is obvious. Actually, every time I go, especially not having been there for a few years, and then you go back to China, it's unbelievable the amount of progress that they've made. Okay, take you through a couple of examples. So this company, Brooks Automation, that is no longer producing because of it's too high tech. These are load ports that are used for the front end of semiconductor tools. An example of a vacuum robot that we used to produce in China, but is no longer produced in China because of what's going on. And we even used to build systems on a contract basis for Applied Materials in Wuxi at the factory. So all that stuff has pretty much come undone. Okay, now, so fast forward, this is a new project. This is my second startup, which was a solar company in Xinjiang. Okay, got off to a great start. The government committed to build the factory. They built it in record time. Beautiful factory. Installed the equipment, ran the process. We were making solar panels. We were making inverters. We set up a systems business in Europe at that time. This is 2008, 2009. All the action was in Germany in those days. So we had a big systems business in Germany. But then one day, the government wanted to introduce me to some people from a big state-owned enterprise company, because this was a JV, by the way. And so this was CNBM. And there we are presenting all the details of our company to these guys. And their idea was they wanted to take over the government share of the JV. And so suddenly a deal is made. And you'll notice this deal has nothing to do with me or my partners. This is between the mayor of Xinjiang and the heads of CNBM. And so anyway, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And you would think that, hey, this team, we can work happily ever after. But sadly, that was not the case. And this was not an example of a great joint venture after that change. And so these are like hard lessons that I learned. But you know what? So that's just one example of a lot of cases that I could go through. And if anybody's interested in talking to me about other things, based on all those other companies I showed, I'm perfectly willing to have that conversation if people want to talk to me about that. But if you are persistent enough and you know how to have fun in China, and you know how to work hard, and you have the support of your family. So one thing is, I kept my family with me the whole time. So every adventure that we went on, we were always together. And if you can keep that going, then something good can happen to you. That happened to me a couple of weeks ago, which is my two sons just graduated from college with degrees in software engineering. So that's in Boulder, Colorado. Yeah. CU Boulder. So it's all worth it. And actually, I have a lot of positive and negative things to say about my experience in China, but generally speaking, looking back over it all, I wouldn't change anything. And I would say it was very positive, and I learned a lot. So I wouldn't recommend anybody shy away from just trying to do business with China the way we've always been doing business. But of course there's limitations, but it's still the biggest business opportunity on the planet at this moment is the interaction between China and the US, and the interaction between China and the EU. So thank you.